Hello, welcome again to the Introduction to the Old Testament course. I hope things are going well so far. If not, feel free to email me and let me know how things are going for you, or to ask any particular questions that you might have. And also we have the discussion boxes that are on the Moodle site, where you can leave feedback or ask questions about any technical problems you may be having. But I hope and trust that things are at least going okay so far, and I look forward to further engaging with your insightful comments on the Moodle site. So today we'll be talking a little bit about prophets in ancient Israel. We'll talk about the ancient Near East a bit, and about divination, and then we'll talk a little bit about the book of Amos, which I've asked you to read as an example of prophetic literature in the Bible. So first, let me just say that, as I've mentioned several times in this class so far, and it's the thing that I want to emphasize, I think, the most. I think it's the most consequential thing for our interpretive practices of the Bible, and that's that I believe that God is an incarnational God who speaks to people in certain times and places with the language and the cultural resources and the cultural imaginations that they have that are available to them, precisely because if God wants to speak to us, God has to speak in ways that we can understand. If God starts to tell me the unfiltered truths of the universe and of theology, I will just not understand them. God has to speak to me in human language, in John Calvin's words, in a condescending way. That doesn't mean that God is being rude to us, but just that it means that God is going to try to smush the truths of the universe into human language and culture. And that also means, I believe, that God uses the technologies, the rituals, the cultural metaphors and so on that are available at whatever time God is working with people. So, in the ancient Near East, and ancient Israel is an ancient Near Eastern people, thoroughly ancient Near Eastern, there was an assumption. Every single ancient culture that we have record of in the ancient Near East believes that there are prophets. There are people who can access information from the divine world. Now, there isn't one word in all these ancient Near Eastern cultures that means prophets. There's actually a bunch of different words. Prophet, the word comes from the Greek word prophetes, kind of to speak forth, really to reveal information about the divine world to the human world. But we can see that this function, that is, people who are assumed to be able to communicate with the divine world, occur throughout the ancient Near East. But we can also see that prophets are a subset of a larger category of people and activities and even supposed technologies. I say supposed because I'm sorry, I don't really think that ancient Near Eastern priests were conversing with Baal or with Marduk, the assumed god of Babylon. But I do think that they thought that they were actually discussing the future and of ominous events and so on with these divinities. I do think people in ancient Babylon thought that they were hearing words from Marduk. But prophets are a subset, as I said, of a larger category of technologies and peoples and assumed ideas, which we can put in the category of divination. Divination simply means trying to get information from the divine world in any way that we can. You can see here this picture. You've probably been looking at this thinking, what the heck is this? That is a model of a liver, a clay model of a liver. And it's not a human liver, it's a clay model of a sheep liver. And you can see it's divided into boxes, and if you look very closely at this image, you might be able to see some scratches on it. Those scratches are actually cuneiform, it's Mesopotamian writing, that says what part of the liver you're looking at. This is a model that was to teach people who were going to become omen readers or divination priests to be able to read a liver. The assumption is, in the ancient world, that the gods write on the world. They write on inanimate objects and animate objects. They'll try to communicate to people in the world through these, what seem to us, obscure communication tactics, like through the flight of birds, through the movement of the stars and the sun in the sky, through the movement of the moon and any other celestial bodies, through things like eclipses, through certain meteorological phenomenon like a type of sunrise or sunset. There was also the assumption that sheep's livers were a very easy way for the gods to communicate with people, almost like we write on paper because it's easy to write on paper. Well, this is the assumption of the ancient world, is that the gods write on sheep livers. It's a very good tablet for the gods to write on for some reason. So there were priests whose job it was to sacrifice these animals, sheep in general, and to read their livers. And any abnormal or strange occurrence of a liver, if there was a certain part of the liver that was bigger or smaller, it was assumed that the gods were trying to communicate to people through that. And so what these priests would do is they would keep these long lists. Ancient Eastern folks tended to think conceptually in terms of list making. So they made these giant lists of like things that they found odd that day: an odd sheep liver, an odd sunrise, an odd instance of certain stars being in places they didn't expect them to be. An eclipse is another example. Any strange phenomena, birds flying in strange patterns, they would write that down. Then they would write down the events of that day, and they would try to find patterns. And the assumption is that they were learning a language, a divine language, that the gods were trying to communicate to them through the strange events of the world. This took lots of training. These priests, these omen-reading priests, were highly trained. They were highly paid. They were oftentimes from aristocratic families. They got to communicate with the king. The king would be very interested to learn anything that they thought they had discerned from this type of writing, this divine writing. And the king would oftentimes base his future activities on what he thought he had learned from these priests. In Mesopotamia, the name for these priests was the Baru priests. But so anyway, this is one example of this kind of clay model that we find really everywhere in the ancient world, and even in ancient Greece and Rome. This was a shared assumption throughout the Mediterranean world. Here's some other examples in museums. You can find these in any major museum that has an ancient or Eastern collection. You can find them here in Atlanta at the Carlos Museum at Emory University. You can find them in Chicago at the Oriental Institute. You can find them in Washington, D.C., and actually several locations. These are scattered all throughout the world, and probably there's at least one close to you somewhere, I'm sure, wherever you are. Here is a Neo-Assyrian a wall relief, a carving on a king's wall, that shows two priests, a priest and an assistant, working with a sheep that has been sacrificed, and this Baru priest is reading the liver of the sheep, trying to feel it and understand the future through it. So divination is the major category of communicating or trying to understand and get information about the world of the gods. And oftentimes it wasn't really about the future, the distant future. It was about the immediate future, and it was also about what was happening right there and then at that time. So that is, should the king go to war right now? Should the king raise taxation? Should the king punish this person a certain way? The answers to big questions like this would be understood to be given through these communicative techniques via the gods, and really through these omen priests who would read and interpret these things. Well, there's a small subset of divination in the ancient Near East, and again, we find these people everywhere in the ancient Near East, but almost everywhere we find them, they are not well respected, and these people are prophets. Prophets did not have the technical training, the aristocratic background, the wealth and power, the access to the king that we know that the omen priests had, the diviners. In every culture where there are temples, we can find people who hang out at the temples and oftentimes sit next to a cult statue of the god that is represented there in the temple, and they just wait. They wait to get messages, direct messages. So we might call this like direct divination, as opposed to indirect divination, like reading stars and reading livers. That is, you're trying to get a message from the gods that is kind of in code, an indirect message. Well, prophets are people who get direct messages from God, and they are almost always depicted as messengers. That is, they just like a messenger who sits next to a king doesn't necessarily understand the message that they're given. They're not understood to have any input into the message, right? I mean, when a UPS delivery person shows up at your front door, you don't ask them how to set up the DVD player that you've ordered or whatever, the new TV you've ordered. You don't ask them details on how to set it up because it's not their job. They're the delivery person. They don't really know. They don't have the technical training to help you with all the stuff that they're delivering. In that same way, messengers in the ancient world were not understood to be super competent technicians, or they weren't understood to know a lot about foreign policy or even about religion. They were just delivering messages. And prophets were the message deliverers of the divine world. That is, they would show up someplace and they would use the common messenger formula. That is, when a messenger showed up, a messenger would say something like, "Thus says X," X being the name of whoever they're delivering the message from. So a messenger of King David would say, "Thus says King David." And that would let you know that it's not the messenger's words, it's the king's words that are being reported. This is the assumption of prophets, that they're all throughout the ancient world. They're not intelligent necessarily, they're not trained, they're not special. They are people who sit next to a cult statue of a god or goddess, and they just wait to get a message. And when they get a message, they go. And when they get a message, they tend to go into something called a frenzy. This is not a derogatory term, it's a technical term actually in psychology, but they go into a trance state or a fugue state. You know, if you've ever been walking somewhere and you arrive at your destination and you kind of think, I was in a daze that whole time I was walking, I don't even know how I got there. Well, you were in a fugue state. If you trained yourself to recognize and respect these states and even appreciate them and try to relax in them and accept them, you can actually train yourself to easily go in and out of these fugue states. This is what we think these ancient prophets would have been going into, prophet of Ishtar. And you can see here, this is a cylinder seal, this image. This is someone's signature. And this on the signature, you can see someone kneeling down inside a building. That's a temple, that kind of building with the pillars. And there are protective gods on either side with wings and horned helmets. That's a sign of divinity in the ancient world. And they have little buckets, and that's of water, and they have little pine cones, and they're sprinkling protective blessing water on this temple. This is a Mesopotamian image, and in the center there standing is Ishtar, the goddess, I think. Yeah, that's Ishtar. And she is blessing and giving some sort of message to someone who's kneeling there. This is probably an image of someone kneeling before the cult statue of the goddess Ishtar in Mesopotamia, and receiving a divine message that they will then go deliver. So in other words, this is a little signature image of a prophet, or this is someone who understood themselves to be a carrier, a bearer of a divine message. So again, these people are found everywhere. When we talk about prophets in ancient Israel, this is something that the ancient Israelites would have understood from the culture that they were in. In other words, I don't think that prophets are necessarily, they're not an Israelite phenomenon. God didn't create the idea of prophecy to then use it just with Israel. God used a technology or a seeming technology that was readily available in the ancient world and that everyone would have understood. And the prophets in ancient Israel do speak in many ways that would have been interpreted in the ancient Near East. That people would have understood what they were trying to say and do. That is, when Amos shows up and says, "Thus says Yahweh," thus says the Lord, right, the name of Israel's God, everyone gets it. Amos is a messenger, divine messenger. Amos is a prophet. Of course, Amos says he's not really a prophet, but this is a part of ancient Israel's, a deeper part of their tradition, where it's not just that God uses the stuff that's available from culture. God also always changes some of it. So we can compare ancient Near Eastern prophets to ancient Israelite prophets and see there's lots of similarities, but we can also see that there are many differences. And in these differences, I think we can find some really important, significant theological learnings for us. So here's just an example of an ancient Near Eastern text. This is a letter in which a king of Mari is being told something about a prophet, that a prophet has said something in public. And it's understood that the king of Mari, this ancient Babylonian or near Babylonian kingdom, wants to hear from what the prophets have to say, because there might be some divine messages buried in there. But also the king is pretty much everywhere in the ancient Near East where we find messages that are delivered by prophets. The kings are always a little bit worried about the prophets too. They're not to be trusted in the same way that a divination priest is to be trusted. They're not from the right background. They don't have the right learning and so on. But in ancient Israel, for some reason, there's more of an emphasis on prophets and prophecy. And of course, as we know from looking at, say, Deuteronomy, there is a reticence to talk about divination and omens. Of course, there's some of that stuff in the Bible. We do see that the sun and moon and stars do sometimes communicate some messages, or at least some people understand them to be communicating some messages in ancient Israel. We do think that they thought things were ominous sometimes. There were some messages that God tried to give through the way that the universe works and so on. But in general, ancient Israelites were much more interested in the direct messages from God to the people. And this is an unusual aspect of ancient Israelite religion and tradition. We have messages from ancient Israel that are found in situ in archaeological finds. That means that we can date these things to the Iron Age, to the time of the Israelite and Judahite monarchy. These three potsherds here, you can see they're broken pieces of pottery. That's what people used for letter writing materials. They didn't have paper that was easily used then or made. You had to import all papyrus from Egypt, so it was expensive. But what was not expensive was pieces of pot that you'd broken. So you'd reuse the broken pots and write letters on them using ink. And so you can see this is writing here, and it's in the ancient script, the Paleo-Hebrew script, the old Hebrew script, before they had adopted the square script that we understand to be what Hebrew is written in today. But so this is this ancient script, and these letters are probably from the year or so before the fall of Jerusalem. These letters are from and to military leaders in Lachish, a major city in Judah. And some of them mention prophets and what prophets are having to say. In fact, one of them even says something that I believe is a reference to Jeremiah, that is a literal reference to Jeremiah from sometime around the year 590 or so, 589, 587, between that range of time, but probably something more like 590, 589. And it's a quotation, it seems to be from a prophecy that we can also find in the book of Jeremiah. So amazing stuff but we know that these prophets were respected in ancient Israel, and that their words were deemed important by military commanders and kings alike. So when we get this image of ancient Israelite prophets, we can already see some differences that are starting to emerge between Israel and its ancient Eastern context, but also some similarities. That is, prophets are messengers. They're messengers from the divine world, from God. They come bearing the message. We see that there's a transformation in ancient Israelite history that shifts from prophets being just bearers of the word to being important people in their own right. And the very fact that these stories about Elijah and Elisha, some of the earlier prophets in Israel, are more Baroque and developed than the stories about the prophets that occurred a century or so earlier, 2 centuries earlier. So Nathan seems to be one of the first prophetic figures that gets depicted as a prophet, as people would recognize a prophet being depicted in ancient Israelite literature in the Bible. So in the books of Samuel, you see Nathan show up, but Nathan doesn't get a book. He doesn't even get a whole lot of stories to himself. That you can see in Elisha and Elijah stories, which depict events of about a century and a half later, that there is a focus on these characters, and they get lots of stories, kind of a story cycle about them. And then you can see later on in history, about 100 years after Elisha and Elijah, in the middle of the 8th century, so right around the year 750 or so, we get the book of Amos. It's the first ever known book that is named after a particular prophet that says that it records the words and collects the words of a particular prophet. That is, the words of prophets are found throughout the ancient Near East, but no one collected them into a book and wrote, said these are all the words of this one named prophet. Again, the names of prophets weren't that important in the ancient world. They were just messengers. They were just UPS delivery people, right? They showed up at your door with the package, and you didn't ask them about what was in the package. But for some reason, Amos signifies a shift to thinking of these folks as important in their own right and as really theologians, people who had a message to give about God that had a distinctive shape to it. And so you wanted to collect the words of that particular messenger. So one thing that's really important in my mind about the Bible and about prophetic literature is that we want to look at the words of each prophet as a collection of an individual prophet's speeches and writing and stories about that prophet that give a particular witness to God. And so we shouldn't proof text by pulling particular biblical passages out of context and looking at them as kind of generic sayings. And we should also not imagine that all the prophets are saying exactly the same thing. That is, each one of them has a distinctive witness that is unique, and they're collected as a book for that purpose. As Amos has some things to say that sound like Amos, and Micah has some things to say that sound like Micah, and Isaiah has some things that sound like Isaiah. And they all have a distinctive witness, and we shouldn't combine them. In the same way that we shouldn't combine the 4 Gospels and say there's just one story about Jesus. No, there's 4 stories about Jesus in the Gospels. And And they are distinct. And the early church said, don't paper over the differences between these. Respect that there is a variety of ways to see Jesus that are depicted in the Bible. In that same way, there's a variety of prophetic messages in the Bible. So when we read a prophetic book like Amos, we will get a particular prophetic lens, a particular witness, a particular theology. And so that should be our goal when we read these texts, is to figure out what makes Jeremiah, Jeremiah, what makes Ezekiel, Ezekiel. And I would propose that there's two steps to that. The first is just to recognize where and when is this prophet speaking. When, what century is it? What's going on in the world? What's going on in Israel? Because the prophets are almost always talking about very particular, specific things that are happening at the particular, specific time in the culture to which they're speaking. Again, God speaks to people in times and places in ways they can understand. I do think that Isaiah speaks about things in ways that apply to Jesus many centuries later, but I don't think that means that Isaiah was talking over people's heads at his time. That is, I think everything Isaiah says, everything Amos says, can be applied directly to the events of their own day. But also, as Isaiah says, the word of the Lord never fails. When prophecy comes true, people expect it to come true again and again and again, and to reactivate in new ways, in new places, in new times, and even say new things. So that's why people write down the words of these prophets and collect them, because they assume that they can come alive again in each new context in the future. But we can often see how they work and what ways they work well by putting it back in its ancient context and trying to understand it there. What was Amos saying to the people in his own day and age in ways that they could understand about their own day and age? What was Isaiah saying about his own day and age? And then we can say, what are contexts in our own day that look like that? That is, can we understand something about the words of Amos if we look for similar social issues, similar theological issues, similar events in the world? So Amos talks a lot about foreign policy and about foreign powers. Isaiah talks a lot about foreign powers and foreign policy too. It's actually a fascinating part of this literature is that they're talking about all sorts of stuff. So maybe we could look at analogies to our own day and age. How is the world working today? How is the community of believers working today? How are our ethics working today? And we can try to draw connections between them and really understand prophetic literature that way. So I'm going to focus just a little bit on Amos here, just to give you a little background to it and try to give you some footing in one biblical book so that maybe you can sort of extrapolate this to other biblical books, and you can try to look at Micah and Isaiah and so on in these ways. So Amos, what do we know about Amos? Well, actually, we know a lot about Amos compared to other ancient Eastern prophets, most of whom we don't even know their names. If we do know their names, we just know their name and then the message they gave. That's it. But Amos, someone collected his stuff in a book, said in the first sentence, the superscription, chapter 1, verse 1, they told us a whole lot about Amos, exactly when he prophesied, dating by kings, right? So whenever you read a biblical prophet, look for this superscription, this first sentence of the book, the chapter 1, verse 1, that tells you when they prophesied, oftentimes tells you where they prophesied, oftentimes tells you some other information about them. So we know that Amos saw these words, he had visions. He also saw this message, these words of God. And we also know that he prophesied a couple years before an earthquake. Now, I think that's significant information because the next verse, chapter 1, verse 2, Amos says something about Yahweh roaring from Zion. My guess is that people understood this to be a reference that there was going to be an earthquake, and that Amos said there's going to be an earthquake, and there was an earthquake 2 years later. And someone wrote down all Amos's words because he was right. In other words, when someone says something's going to come true and it comes true, you write down all their stuff, and then you look for how it's going to come true again in the future. This is the reason we have these prophetic books. So I do think that this kind of superscription to Amos is really important. It tells us that Amos lived and worked in the middle of the 8th century BC. He prophesied to the northern kingdom, but he also came from the south, from a little city called Tekoa. We know that there's another bit of biographical information in chapter 7, where there's a little story about Amos that occurs. Chapter 7, verse 10 is the beginning of the story, where Amos gets in a fight with Amaziah, the high priest of the temple of Bethel in the northern kingdom of Israel. And Amos says, I basically work with sheep. I don't think this means he's a little shepherd boy. I think it means that the way it's phrased, that he's a dresser of sycamore trees, and he works with sheep. I do think that the particular words used there seem to indicate that he's a factory farmer. He owns a giant area with lots of sheep. He owns huge plantations of basically fig-like trees, trees that produce a certain kind of fruit. It's not the kind of sycamore trees that you and I have. They produce a kind of fruit that's barely edible, but you have to process it a lot, and it becomes this kind of fast food almost in ancient Israel. So this kind of massive farm was probably something that Amos owned. He employed lots of shepherds. He was the head overseeing shepherd, if you will. And Amos was called to leave his flock and to tell a message. And so Amos says, I'm not really a prophet in chapter 7. I'm not really a prophet because some people are trained to be prophets. They grow up sitting there in the temple. Some people are from families where the fathers or mothers, there were, by the way, lots of women prophets in ancient Israel. Unfortunately, none of them have a book named after them. This probably is due to changing conceptions of gender and revelation during the course of ancient Israelite history. But there were, like Deborah and Huldah, that you can read about in 2 Kings. There were many women prophets in ancient Israel. So these men and women would have sat in the temple or sat in local ritual cultic sites and tried to hear words from God. And then they would relay them. And they would sometimes train their children how to do this. So they were prophetic families. But Amos says, I'm not from those families, and I'm not really a prophet. I just got picked by God, and God told me to give a message. So he is a prophet in that way, but he's not a prophet as in he doesn't do this for his job, his real job, which also gives him some freedom to be able to say, I'm not doing this for money, so I don't care what you say. Amaziah, the high priest of Bethel, you can kick me out and tell me I'm not going to get fed for my work. That's fine. I don't depend on it for money. Is part of his message. We know these things about Amos. We also know that it seems that he had a short ministry because it says in chapter 1, verse 1 in the superscription that he worked 2 years before the earthquake, which that makes me assume at least that he just prophesied for a year or less. Amaziah in chapter 7, verses 10 through 17, in that biographical bit, tells Amos that he's performing treason because he's saying that the king, God is angry at the king. Prophets in the ancient Near East told the king that the king was great because their lives depended on it. That is, the king didn't like being told that the king was bad and mean. The king only liked being told that the king was good. The prophets, if they said that the king had to do something differently, they had to couch it in very nice, respectful language, and oftentimes would give the king quite a bit of praise, all scattered throughout the message. But Amos does none of that, and he draws upon a particularly Israelite prophetic tradition of people who yell at kings. This is just typical of ancient Near Eastern literature. Of ancient Israelite prophecy. It's not typical of ancient Near Eastern literature in general. Prophets in the ancient Near East didn't do this kind of thing. Why did it happen in Israel? I don't know, but my guess is that Nathan has the courage to stand up to David and tell him the truth, that he is a murderer and a rapist, rapes Bathsheba and murders Uriah, or at least arranges the murder of Uriah, and tells him that he has done wrong and he needs to repent, and that David doesn't kill him for it. David says, you're right, and David repents. And my guess is that this starts a tradition in ancient Israel of people needing to respect prophets. Kings couldn't just kill prophets. Jeremiah was on death row a couple times, and in one of those instances that he was on death row, in Jeremiah chapter 26, his life was preserved and saved because someone remembered that Micah many years ago had said that Jerusalem was going to be destroyed someday, and that Micah wasn't killed for it. So again, this tradition in ancient Israel that the kings shouldn't kill the prophets. Now, kings sometimes do kill prophets in ancient Israel, but it's understood to be a bad thing in general. So in any event, Amos has the guts and the courage to stand up to Amaziah. I think it's possible that Amos ends up getting executed for treason. That's why he has such a short ministry. But also his words get preserved because that was understood to be a thing that shouldn't have been done, and that Amos was speaking the truth. So speaking the truth to those in authority seems to be a hallmark of ancient ancient Israelite tradition, something that stands out over and against ancient Near Eastern practice. And because of these brave folk, we can get a lineage of prophets that do stand up to those who have significant power and want to manipulate God's message. And this is how we get people like Jesus, who are able to stand up bravely and boldly and proclaim the truth. This is how we get John the Baptist. This is how we get Paul, who's willing to stand up to the authorities and say, you're wrong. Of course, some of them pay for it with their lives. Many of them do. But their words get preserved, not as the words of traitors, even though they're executed many times as traitors. So the context for Amos, I'll just say this briefly, is that things were going great for Israel around the year 750 when Amos prophesied. There had been a huge collapse at the end of the Iron Age around the year 1200, where all the major world powers, all the major world empires, took a hiatus. They just could not put together a massive army for generations. Ancient Israel emerged with other peoples of the ancient Levant, emerged as a power during that time. By the year 750, Assyria in Mesopotamia had started to wake up as a major power, and a king named Tiglath-Pileser III, a major king, who was actually mentioned several times in the Bible, turned Assyria into a war machine again and began to invade near the Levant. And on this map, you can see these arrows leading from Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, that are moving slowly, inexorably down toward the area where Jerusalem is. So in 854, there was a battle at Karkar, which is basically modern-day Syria, and they were rebuffed. Assyria was rebuffed by a coalition of powers, including Israel. But by 732, Damascus had fallen, which, of course, is close to Israel. So there was a movement from Assyria over that century to get very close to Israel with its imperial war machine. In 750, though, ancient Israel was richer than it had ever been before. We know this because of archaeological finds. We can see they had built bigger buildings. We know that things were going really well for them militarily. Again, things were about to change, but they didn't know that. And things were going well for them in terms of their regional power. That is, they had power over many vassal empires, vassal kingdoms like Moab and Edom and so on. They had been able to project their power very well. So everything looked like it was going great, never better. Except that Israel had transformed from a community of people that did not have much prosperity, but that generally shared it fairly equally, to a highly inequitable culture. We can see this from the archaeological remains. The average house size in Israel in the year 1000 is larger than the average house size in the year 750, even though we can see that the economy had boomed, precisely because we can see these giant palaces that emerge. But the average person's house becomes a shack. That is, ancient Israel was transforming during the century before the time of Amos, the prophet Amos's prophecies. Ancient Israel transforms from a small but fairly equitable polity into a highly inequitable but highly prosperous polity. And many people were becoming slaves. That is, debt slaves. This had become a massive problem. Amos talks about it, but we see it in lots of literature from this time period, and we can actually see archaeological evidence of this. That is, we can find communities that were actual communities with lots of houses that then transform into plantations. That is, there's one giant house in the middle of it. They demolish the small houses, and basically there are shacks all around. We can also see that during this time, agricultural products boom. That is, the amount of grain, the storage pits for grain explode in size and number at the exact same time that people aren't living in nice houses anymore. So this is a shock, I think, to the system in ancient Israel. Here's the archaeological remains of the palace in Samaria. So Samaria gets built as the capital city of the northern kingdom, which is the people to whom Amos prophesies. And there weren't palaces like this in Samaria before. Samaria was bought. It was a hilltop someone owned it named Shemer, a guy, as a farm. And this farm gets turned into a massive capital by Omri, one of the kings of the northern kingdom, and gets turned into an opulent center of power. At the same time, you can see local towns in the area that basically dissolve. They're turned into, again, a plantation. We also see the explosion of luxury items. We can't really find any luxury items in Samaria before that. Again, it was some guy's farm. Well, we start to find ivory objects. Here's ivory lions that would have been part of a throne and so on. We can find lots of these ivories actually from Samaria. We can find them in archaeological finds in Assyria, because Assyria ends up destroying the northern kingdom of Israel. This is what Amos prophesied would happen, and they take all of the stuff to Assyria, where it has been found recently. But we know these things actually come from Samaria, at least some of them. So these are ivory lions that probably would have been a part of a throne that were deported and taken away to Assyria. So Amos begins his message in the middle of this culture which has changed radically in terms of its economy and in terms of its politics, in terms of its communal understanding of itself, but also we think in terms of its theology. Now, why we think that in ancient Israel it would seem to be really important that the king doesn't acquire a whole lot of stuff. If you look at Deuteronomy chapter 17, it's the law of the king. It says don't acquire lots of stuff. Don't acquire horses. Don't build up your wealth. And if you look at the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel chapters 8 through 12, there's a polemic against kings. Kings shouldn't take all this stuff. Kings shouldn't take your people. They should make debt slaves out of your people. We can also see that the two kingdoms, the southern kingdom of Judah and the northern kingdom of Israel, split apart precisely because Solomon and his son Rehoboam were turning people into debt slaves and conscripting labor too much. It was hurting people. Again, the kings begin to acquire too much stuff and power, and it starts to transform some of the ethos of ancient Israel. That is, that God declares to people that everyone matters in the community. Ancient Israel had this amazing idea that every single person has access to land. That's like a birthright of ancient Israel, is that you have access to land. And if your parents fritter it away, of course the Jubilee is supposed to restore your land to your family. Every generation gets a chance, gets a shot at life. Everyone gets access to the stuff they need to produce life. Well, that changes. And when Israel starts to change in that way, the prophets say, you're starting to look like the nations that are around you. It's like you're worshiping other gods. That is, you're making your entire life revolve around the system of the divine beings that are understood to run the ancient Near East outside of Israel. And they love the plantation-style economies. They love the plantation-style societies. They like the hierarchical societies because they want to get food into the temples. That's what they want. Remember, Yahweh says, I don't need your food for your temples, really. I don't need your sacrifices. That's for you, not really me. This is why Amos it says, I don't need and want your sacrifices in chapter 5. Isaiah says the same thing. Hosea says the same thing. God's not really that interested in getting lots of food from the people. That's not the point. But of course, there is a way of being idolaters when you're still worshiping Yahweh. That is, when you start to turn Yahweh into an idol and make Yahweh seem to run society in the way that, say, Baal runs a society, the god of the Canaanites, or Marduk, the god of Babylon, wants to run society. So, in any event, in this context, Amos begins his book with the first two chapters are these oracles against the nations. And I won't read them all here. You can read them and look at your study notes in your Bible. But if you just look at this map over here and then kind of plot, he starts by saying, God, Yahweh, the God of Israel, is angry at Damascus. That is up in Syria, up on the very top of the map. God is angry at Damascus. And if you read these, what God's angry about, it's really about war crimes. God's angry about Gaza. Well, that's in Philistia. God's angry at the Philistines. Well, if Amos is preaching to Israelites in the northern kingdom near Bethel, at the Temple of Bethel probably, sometime around the year 750 BC, he's telling the people God is angry at Damascus. God is angry at those Arameans, those other people. And everyone would have said, yes! And then he says, God's angry at those Philistines for war crimes. Yes! God's going to judge them for what they deserve. God's angry at Tyre. Well, that's at the top of your map again on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Those are the Phoenicians. Yes, God's angry at the Phoenicians. Yes, God's going to get them for competing with us. God's mad at Edom, down at the bottom of your map. Yes, God's angry at them. God's angry at Ammon. That is, people to the east of Israel. Yes, God's angry at our neighbors. God's angry at Moab. Yes. So that is, all these neighboring nations are getting called out by God, and precisely for war crimes. That is, they're not being judged for not following the law of Yahweh. They're being judged because they're committing atrocious war crimes. The way I see this is that, everyone's supposed to know that you don't commit war crimes, that you don't kill innocent people in war, that you don't kill pregnant women in times of war, that you don't desecrate the bodies of people who are slain in war. These are just understood to be revolting things that no one believes you should be doing. Just by virtue of being a human being, you should know you shouldn't do this stuff. But then, of course, Amos next gets mad at Judah in chapter 2. And I think this is a continuation of this conversation. So he's telling people, and God's mad at Judah. Now, Amos himself is from Judah, a little town called Tekoa, south of Jerusalem. But he's speaking to people in the northern kingdom of Israel, in the chapel of Bethel, the royal chapel there. And my guess is that everyone would have said, yes, all right, God's going to get those southerners who those Davidite people down there. Oh, boy, I hate them, right? Our cousins to the south that we're competing with and everything. Oh, boy, I'm so glad God's going to judge them, right? And they're getting judged because they're not following the Torah, that is the law. So now we have a specific thing about Yahweh. Yahweh's mad at Judah for not following the Torah. And then, of course, last of all, and if you look at how many, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 judgments. Sounds like a completion, right? 7, the number of completion. We're done, right? There's no more people to criticize, say the Israelites. But then Amos gets mad at Israel last of all. God is mad at you too. And remember, God's mad at everyone else for war crimes, but Judah for not following the law, the Torah. But God's mad at Israel, not for violating the Torah necessarily, but for hurting their own people and selling their own people into debt slavery. I think Amos is putting this in the category of war crimes. You're committing war crimes against your own people. You're selling people for silver. That is, you're creating a system that forces people into debt. This is literally how it worked. We know this because this is what a lot of the prophets get mad at. Isaiah gets mad at the same thing, confiscating land from people that you forced to go into debt. Even Nehemiah gets mad at the same thing in Nehemiah chapter 5. I mean, this was a problem that ancient Israel had time and again, that its people would get sucked into patterns of debt slavery in schemes that were organized and created really by people who wanted more and more and more and more. People who had the power to create systems that would force people in debt slavery. So if you actually look at the prophets, they get mad. They get real mad sometimes. We have some wrath of God stuff in here. But who are they getting mad at? Sometimes they say Israel, and we interpret that to mean all people. Sometimes they're mad at average people, I guess, but often they're mad at the kings, at the heads, at the elders, at the generals, they're mad at the people who are in charge for doing things that are hurting people at the bottom. In other words, when they talk about idolatry, they're oftentimes talking about the kings and counselors and authorities who are transforming the nation to look like the nations around them. That is, hierarchical plantation style, slavery style, debt slavery style economies. So you can read the rest of Amos and see this pattern replicate throughout, that Amos is mad. God is mad through Amos. But God is mad because ancient Israel was supposed to be a place of blessing to all the nations, but especially to the people inside their group, right? They were supposed to be a priestly nation, Exodus 19 says. But they aren't. They haven't been that. They've transformed into just like everyone else. And so Amos gets mad at them for assuming that they're elect. Chapter 3 of Amos, the people of Israel say, we're elect, we're special. And Amos says, don't you understand, you've been elected to a task. You're going to get judged because you have been given this special trust by God to be agents of goodwill to the world and a blessing to the world. But where you treat your own people like pieces of junk, there you are betraying the trust that God has given to you. So it's a calling to account, and it's a remembering of the covenant with Moses. This is a time and again that the prophets are going to refer to the covenant of Moses because it's in the covenant with Moses, that is in Exodus and in Deuteronomy, that we're going to find lots of references. You need to help the poor. You need to help the vulnerable people among you. You need to help orphans and widows. You need to help aliens who are wandering among you. These people count. And it's this message that the prophets, many of them, keep coming back to again and again. So, Amos talks about justice and righteousness. And you can find this throughout the book. I recommend focusing on chapter 5 as a main chapter that comes to these themes again and again. And Amos says, don't run to your rituals to your cult sites like Bethel and Gilgal. Don't run to sacrifice and to sing songs and so on in order to cover over your crimes. So he's talking precisely to the elite who would be able to go to the royal chapels at Bethel and who would be able to participate in the liturgies there. And in chapter 8, verses 4 through 7, Amos also has a little bit where he gets mad at the wealthy merchants who go to the Sabbath and go to these different sacrificial rituals and public rituals and so on. And the whole time they're just waiting for it to be over so they can go oppress people some more and take some more debt slaves. Again, Amos thinks that the people assume that they're buying off God with their worship. And so Amos says, your worship doesn't buy off God. Your worship is merely a part of your whole life, which is dedicated to justice and righteousness. Or it's nothing at all. That's what makes Israel important and unique. And I think this is the core of Amos's message, but also the core of almost all the prophets. You look at Micah, and Micah's really mad that the kings in Samaria and Jerusalem are transforming the culture so that people get turned into debt slaves and they confiscate their land. That's what Micah's really mad about. And Micah envisions a future day where that can change, where there'll be a king who treats people like a true shepherd. This is also, if you look at, just read the book of Isaiah, chapter 5. Isaiah sings the song about the vineyard. But then after it, he explains it, that there's no righteousness, there's bloodshed, that is, people are being taken advantage of and their lives are being extinguished, and there's a cry of injustice. Sa'ak, there's a cry of injustice. And then he goes on to explain that, the rest of chapter 5. People are rich, wealthy people are confiscating the land of the poor people, and they're taking their houses away. It seems to be a core message of these prophets. Now, there's lots of other messages of the prophets, but this seems to be one of the elements that they all share in their messages, is this concern for the covenant of Moses and the blessing of all people that has been trampled by many of those who are in power. So, in any event, this is just a beginning and introduction to the book of Amos, but you might want to take a look at the visions of Amos near the end of the book and so on and see how some of these patterns replicate. The wrath and anger of God in these books is not a wrath and anger that is directed at poor individuals or at people who lie every now and again or something like that. I don't think God's happy with lying, obviously, but I do think that the wrath of God, the anger of God, is directed at people who are hurting others. And the destructive acts of God, like Jeremiah talks about how God is going to uproot things and knock things down. I believe that those references are because there are sometimes when systems become evil, intolerably evil, God needs to do something about it. God needs to undo the system. And this is the Exodus story. God gives chance after chance after chance to Pharaoh and Egypt to transform their ways, to become just and righteous, right? To let the Israelites go, to do the right thing. And there are people's lives who are in the balance. And eventually God says, if you won't do it, I'll do it for you. And then it involves destruction. I don't think God's happy about it. I think it's a traumatic thing. I think it's sad. There are huge negative consequences. But ultimately God says, if you don't dismantle destructive systems, I will dismantle them for you. And the whole purpose of this, Amos says there will be a destruction that will come. But the idea is that this might give us the chance to be reborn as a people who have hope. That this might give us a chance to rebuild a system that will be more just in the future. It's a terrifying message, but it's one that I think we can heed and try to imagine where might we be hearing this today. That is, there are systems of injustice and of that prohibit people and even things outside of people, like nature, from enjoying the blessings and flourishings that God intends. And where we stop those things, where we actively try to harm and keep people from enjoying their flourishing and blessing that God desires for them, those structures that we built to keep that from happening will be dismantled someday. And the civil rights movement is a good example of this. The civil rights leaders use Amos a lot. Right, so Martin Luther King Jr. In his famous speech, the "I Have a Dream" speech, quotes Amos: "Let justice and righteousness flow down like unending streams." I mean, this idea that justice and righteousness are going to flow down. The question is, are we going to knock down the dam, or is God going to have to do it for us? That are damming up waters of justice and righteousness and keeping them from reaching the people. This is a task for today, I think, and a message that I take seriously, and that weighs on me, I'll be honest, from time to time. But it's also a message that I believe the church needs to hear. So that's my take on the prophets. I know there's lots more to be said, but hopefully this is